Hello, welcome to Secure Talk, your trusted source of information on the latest threats, trends, tools, and technology related to cybersecurity and compliance.
Hello, everybody. Welcome to Secure Talk. My name is Mark Schreiner, and I'll be your host for this episode of Secure Talk. Today, we're going to be talking with Geoff White, who's an investigative journalist and has published a couple books related to cybercrime. I think his first book, or one of the earlier books, was Crime.com, From Viruses to Vote Rigging, How Hacking Went Global. And his most recent book, The Lazarus Heist, From Hollywood to High Finance, Inside North Korea's Global Cyber Warfare. We're going to be talking to Geoff about his books and some of the latest, greatest activities that these state-organized cyber hacker groups are up to. But first off, let's welcome Geoff. Geoff, how are you today?
I'm good, Mark. How are you?
Pretty good. Where do we find you at today?
I'm North London based.
Yeah, how are things there?
All right, but a bit grey. We've had our bank holiday weekend, our Jubilee weekend, which was full of sun and bunting and Union Jacks and stuff, and now it's just a grey Monday. So I think everybody's come down to earth with a bit of a bump today, unfortunately.
Yeah, we here in Seattle, we've had the wettest May on record, and I think we're on track for the wettest June. I mean, it's
Nice.
it's amazing. So I think we can probably compare the comparable climates. So I got to ask you. I mean, do you've written about these different organizations around the world. Are you able to do most of your research from the UK, or do you have to get out and about and talk to people around the world?
A lot of it you can do from the UK. I mean, obviously the advantage of writing a book is that you, unlike working for TV and film and so on, you don't have to necessarily go and see people. So you can do quite a lot of it from home and from the UK. However, there are just certain instances where you have to go there. You have to actually see what's going on. You have to meet the people. You have to look at the locations. So some of the stories that I've covered in the Lazarus Heist book particularly took place in the Philippines. So I went out to the Philippines to sort of see the geography of that and to meet the people who are actually involved. So it's always good. It's always good to get FaceTime with people and get your boots on the ground, I think.
That makes a lot of sense. I would imagine that, I mean, a lot of people would be kind of reluctant to talk. And how do you find people that are, one, credible, and two, willing to kind of share what they know with you?
Yeah, well, it's a really good question, and it's good that you pointed out the difference. So there are lots of people who want to talk but don't know anything, and lots of people who know a lot of things but don't want to talk. And so you're looking for the sort of sweet spot between the two, really. The ability to try and track people down and convince them to talk is basically one of the major tasks for me as an investigative journalist. I mean, getting the story, getting the facts straight, understanding it is one thing, but particularly for podcasts, which I've done, and for the book, you want to hear from the first-hand sources. You want to hear from the person who was in the room at the time. And so for me, there's a lot of reading legal documents. There's a lot of reading technical reports. There's a lot of reading other people's blogs and listening to other people's podcasts and books and so on. But then fundamentally, it's like working out, okay, who can tell this? What is the story? What are the components of that story? It needs to be something that, is an event that happened somewhere in the world, and there was an ABC, this happened and then that happened and then that happened. And then the question after that is, okay, I've got the story. I know what happened. I understand it. Who can I get to tell me and the readers and listeners and viewers what actually happened at that time?
Yeah, it seems like it would be. Yeah, I mean, you're definitely a one part detective, one part journalist, and then you're putting together this amazing puzzle. Why don't you? I mean, before we talk about the Lazarus Heist, maybe you can talk about some of the main or major hacks that you covered in Crime.com, and just kind of gives so that you set the stage in terms of how did these organizations emerge, and and then how have their activities kind of changed over the last 15, 20 years?
Yeah, it's a good question. I mean, Crime.com, the idea of that first book was really to map out as much as I could the territory of cybercrime. I really was aiming for people who had no knowledge in the space at all, that they would be able to read it and understand it and enjoy it, or at least find it compelling. But what I also hoped was that people who were in the industry would at least see that I hadn't got anything wrong, and hopefully find out a few tidbits of information that weren't previously in the public domain. So what I did was traced computer hacking from the very earliest origins, from its sort of birth in the sort of hippie hacker movement, really, of the 70s, and traced it all the way through things like the fall of the Berlin Wall, which had a huge impact, I think, on the emergence of cybercrime.
How so?
Well, you've got to realize that the Soviet Union, like a lot of communist countries, valued technical and scientific knowledge above many, many other subjects. There were more science and engineering grads going through Russian universities in the 90s than there were any other subject put together. It was absolutely astonishing. And these people were going into, scientific and technical jobs within the Soviet Union. The early 90s come, the Soviet Union collapses. A lot of those people were just out of a job. There wasn't the industry that at the time the world was booming in terms of information technology and it was taking off. Russia was being left behind, and a small but significant minority of people within the former Soviet Union took to cybercrime. They already had, worked out how credit card theft worked, and there was a huge credit card fraud scene. And as those credit cards started being used for online purchases, those crime gangs simply started turning to online means. They followed the money online, and that happened throughout the course of internet banking as well, when internet banking took off in the early noughties. So that fall of the Soviet Union really was a sort of key turning point. But what's interesting is a lot of this is about acquisitive crime. It's basically about getting money, isn't it?
Yeah.
But the real turning point for me is when you start to see governments getting interested in computer hacking and realizing that computer hacking is A, cheap compared to buying tanks and guns and missiles, and B, gives them palpable deniability. It's very, very easy to hide in cyberspace and to carry out attacks that are very hard to attribute. And so the sort of culmination, if you like, of crime.com really was the 2016 US presidential election, where I think we saw the high tide mark as it stands of organized cybercrime tactics being used by nation state hackers to upend an election and to disrupt it, I think is a fair way of putting it. So it's a really remarkable moment. That was the journey that crime.com sort of went on.
Yeah, I'd like to come back to that a little bit later in terms of, these non-monetary kind of cyber activities, because, there's an argument right now that social media is being manipulated by certain actors to kind of sow discord in maybe not just the U.S., but maybe in different places around the world, right? And I'd kind of like to get your opinion on what we see going forward with that. And I'm also assuming that even the U.S. government is probably doesn't have perfectly clean hands, and we may be doing some things as well. And I'd like to come back to that, but let's go ahead and then jump over before that though, because it looks like Lazarus Heist is a very specific story, whereas in crime.com you talked about some major events and kind of the evolution of these nation state actors. What's the general premise of the Lazarus Heist?
Well, the Lazarus Heist grew out of crime.com in a really interesting way. There's one of the chapters of crime.com was about North Korea and how North Korea became a sort of cyber threat of its own right. And one of the interesting things about that chapter was North Korea, for various reasons we can talk about, basically run out of money, very, very short of money. And so what it was doing was using the sort of government hacking tactics that a lot of countries use, pretty much all countries these days, but applying them to a sort of organized cybercrime, acquisitive theft model is the accusation. So, in terms of that coalition and collaboration between government hackers and organized cybercrime, I felt North Korea was really, the apex of that. And the chapter revolved around this remarkable story of the attack by the Lazarus Group, allegedly working on behalf of the North Korean government, on the Bank of Bangladesh, the central bank of that country, and the attempted theft of $1 billion, which became a BBC podcast. It was a 10-part podcast series, which was put out last year in 2021. And that podcast series has now given birth to the book of the Lazarus Heist, because series one of the podcast sort of stops in 2017 with the WannaCry cyber attack. And there's been 5 years of subsequent cyber activity by the Lazarus Group to cover. And so the book really tries to bring that story up to date and really fill in the gaps. And there were some absolute jaw-dropping stories. I mean, if you thought the Bangladesh bank story was crazy, it gets even more bonkers, frankly, in the subsequent years.
Well, and then, so what can you tell us without giving too much away about more of the content of the book, and also this Lazarus Group? I mean, what do we know about it? Is it a formal organization, or is it a loose group of people who work with the North Koreans? Is it actual people in North Korea? What is it?
Yeah, it's a good question. I mean, one thing that's worth getting straight first of all is North Korean hacking is really interesting, because if you think about hacking in the US, for example, or hacking in the UK, well, that could be government hackers. It could be organized criminals. It could be some kid in their bedroom, who's picked up a computer and looked on hack forums and started going. And there's lots of different types of what hacking could be. If you're in North Korea and you have a computer and an internet connection, it's because you've been given it by the government. The only computer hacking really that can exist in North Korea is government sanctioned, government endorsed hacking. It's not possible for an individual just to pick up a computer and sort of start doing it. So when we see computer hacking coming out of North Korea and attributed to North Korea, the assumption is it's got to be government sanctioned at the very least, if not government controlled and endorsed. And so this has led people to look at the different hacks that have been attributed to North Korea. And I will say, I use the Lazarus Group as a slightly lazy journalistic shorthand to describe computer hackers working for the North Korean government. If you read reports, I think CrowdStrike put out a report fairly recently. I think it might have been FireEye actually, who put out the report talking about different types of North Korean hackers. There are lots of different groups. And because North Korea is a militaristic society, most of those computer hackers will be embedded somewhere in the military. They will have a rank. They will be taken into military bases to do their hacking. So it will come out of North Korea's military. And lots of people sort of read the tea leaves about, this particular group being part of this particular unit of the army and that particular group being part of another bit of the military services. For me, that's not very helpful. I just call it the Lazarus Group as a sort of lump term because I don't think it's massively helpful for readers. But yeah, this is the idea that they're working on behalf of the North Korean government. They're part of North Korea's military, and they're mainly working from inside North Korea, although there's evidence with people we spoke to for the podcast and also spoken to for the book that the computer hackers from North Korea are sent outside the country's borders for good reasons. If you're hacking from inside North Korea, you're a target for surveillance, and North Korea has a very narrow window to the internet. So hacking from outside North Korea makes a lot of sense. And also you can hide among the crowd. China, for example, has billions of IP addresses, billions of computer users. If you're trying to hack from inside China, you can hide within the crowd a lot more effectively than you can from North Korea with its tiny number of internet users.
Makes a lot of sense. So, one of the things I don't know if you've been to Korea or spent any time there, but I've lived there off and on for maybe about 5 years, starting in the early 90s. And so, North Korea's activities are kind of always on my radar. I've also lived in Japan, and North Korea and Japan have a kind of a special relationship as well. And North Korea is, they're always looking for ways to make money, not necessarily to disrupt elections. I would say what I've seen, they have their little propaganda wars with South Korea, and they hurl insults at the U.S. But it seems to be a lot of their activities, whether it's selling drugs, importing, exporting arms, it's all basically in an effort to make money. And I'm wondering, what, in terms of their cyber activities, is it mostly geared towards to getting money back to the dear leader?
That is definitely a very large focus for North Korea's computer hackers from what we know of their activities. I've mentioned the attack on Bangladesh Bank, the attempted theft of $1 billion. They only got $81 million out of Bangladesh Bank in the end. And the story of how they tried only, yes, still a lot of money for a country that's
buys a lot of kimchi up there. So
yeah, or cognac. Cognac is apparently the favorite tipple of Kim Jong-un and his cadre. So look, they only got 81 million, as you say, it's still a lot of money. But I mean, compared to the other attacks that they launched on other banks, that pales into insignificance. And then the latest trend has been to target cryptocurrency companies, so Bitcoin exchanges and the like. The amount estimated to have been stolen from those attacks, and this is a vast understatement, I should say, a vast underestimate, is $2 billion. And so there's a huge amount of money going into North Korea. We don't know. I get asked every now and again, how much does that take? How much of North Korea's GDP would that be? Very difficult to say because North Korea doesn't really put out figures on its GDP, and so the estimates are quite hard to come by. But $2 billion is a lot of money. They are doing other types of computer hacking, and there's been attributed attacks for North Korea of trying to get into defense companies, get into diplomats, get into embassies, the usual type of stuff. And frankly, look, the US, the UK, we do that stuff as well. Let's not lie. We are trying to break into other people's systems for strategic advantage. So yes, North Korea do all of that. But what marks them out on the world stage, really, for the researchers who track them, is these very high profile and very, very lucrative attacks on the financial system. And as I say, increasingly the cryptocurrency system.
Well, and I was going to ask you about that in terms of, crypto as a target, but also as a kind of a facilitating, aspect of cyber attacks. What are you seeing?
Well, it's very interesting. There's been a spree of attacks, culminating really, or at least culminating so far. It may even get bigger than this. With this year's attack, 2022, on a game called Axie Infinity, a video game based in Vietnam, headquartered in Vietnam. It's a bizarre story. I mean, video game, to be honest, I'd never heard of Axie Infinity, but it's a video game that's based on a sort of cryptocurrency-esque attribute. Basically, you can buy characters in the game, buy and sell them, and that trading activity is very, very febrile. A lot of people putting their money into these little characters in the game. And so in order to facilitate all those cryptocurrency payments, the game had to have a sort of cryptocurrency arm, effectively, a thing called the Ronin Bridge. And that was what the computer hackers targeted. And they managed to make off with $625 million, which,
oh my gosh.
And I've been saying this before, and I'm willing to be proven wrong on this, but I think that is the largest amount of money stolen from a single target in a single hack ever. The other groups have stolen more money over time from different targets, but one hit, one victim, one amount, I think 625 million is the biggest we've ever seen. And that's all in cryptocurrency and has been made off with apparently by Lazarus Group.
So people were playing this game. Somehow they were giving their payment information, whether that's was a crypto, some type of cryptocurrency or a credit card or something like that, and they were able to get in between there and siphon off. Was that basically what happened?
As I understand it, the way it works is this: if you sign up to Axie Infinity, it's a little bit like you know the old Tamagotchi things, those little creatures you just have to try and keep alive. Yeah. It's a bit like Tamagotchi meets WWF wrestling in that you can buy one of these Axies, which is little creatures. And you pay for that using cryptocurrency. You can then, as you train your little Tamagotchi, your little Axie, and it gets better, you can then sell it to other people. And those trades are obviously conducted through cryptocurrency. Gotcha. And so those trades are recorded. Now, what they wanted to use was the Ethereum blockchain, which is a sort of cryptocurrency way of keeping a record of all the transactions. Mm-hmm. Problem is the Ethereum blockchain moves a little too slowly for the frenetic activity that was going on in the game. So what they needed was some way to take the transactions that happened in the game and stick them on the Ethereum blockchain where they could be recorded publicly. And the thing they did, the conduit they used from the game to the Ethereum blockchain, was a thing called the Ronin Bridge, which took the stuff that happened in the game and stuck it on the Ethereum blockchain for all to see. The Ronin Bridge was what the hackers targeted. When I say the Ronin Bridge, what this comes down to is it's about a dozen computers around the world that basically took the transactions in the game and stuck them on the Ethereum blockchain. If you can take over enough of those computers, you can divert the funds that should be going to the players and to their accounts and to the game, and you can divert them elsewhere. And that's what the hackers did. They took over just enough of those computers, the Ronin Bridge computers, to divert the funds away. And as I say, $625 million later, we suddenly realize what's happened. Astonishing, absolutely astonishing hack.
Amazing, right? And just another reason kids should not be playing video games, man. It's like,
yes, go out and
no,
play
you can't have my
instead,
credit card. No, that's crazy. So let me ask you, from what you see, because we typically hear about those darn North Koreans or the Russians or the Chinese. Is there much of a difference between their methods and their targets?
Yes, I mean, I think it's possible to distinguish between those different countries, and let's face it, that other countries hack as well. France, Sri Lanka, Brazil, the US, the UK. The
US
government
does?
level.
Come on.
Oh yes, surely not. But look, I mean, I think there are distinguishing features between them. And what I would say is, we've already talked about why North Korea is distinctive. This sort of search for money to top up the government's coffers. China generally is very good at not getting caught. I will be honest, I haven't done a huge amount of coverage on Chinese hacking, and it's not because I don't want to or because it doesn't happen. It's because they're very, very, very stealthy. And so getting a case where you really know what happened and where somebody's published enough information for me as a journalist to look into it with Chinese cases is quite difficult. Russia, by contrast, parts of the Russian cybercrime economy are very well known. We have leaks from inside some of these cybercrime gangs. Some of the government hackers inside Russia have had a very bad history of not covering their tracks particularly well. One thing I think is interesting, I'm just going to the point you were making earlier about disinformation and so on, is I tend to find some of the Russian stuff and the disinformation and manipulation stuff really interesting. And I think one thing we have to remember about Russia is that, under the Soviet Union, there was a great deal of disinformation. I mean, the stuff the state was putting out was, to a lot of the people who lived in the Soviet Union, completely unbelievable. So they had to do this double think thing of believing the government propaganda and trotting it out when they needed to, but knowing that it was all bullshit. And that ability to think on two different levels and to play with the truth and to acknowledge that there isn't really any ground truth, or to hold two truths that are opposed simultaneously, is something that's, I feel, ingrained in the Russian psyche, but isn't ingrained in our psyche in the West, because we're told, well, there's one truth and here it is.
No, that's fascinating, and it's having lived in different countries for many years, it's amazing how much a culture can affect the end results or the behaviors and the outcomes in what you're talking about. I mean, obviously North Korea, they're very much focused. I mean, obviously it's a super poor country. They're focused on making money. The Russians, because of their history, have this ability, as you just say, to think on a couple different levels and kind of tease out what's real and what's not. And yeah, in America we have the party line, and it's given by Anthony Fauci. And if you if you dare think anything otherwise, then you're what do they say? Against us, with us, or against us? And obviously against. So that's very interesting. Do you see any other countries kind of emerging as growing cyber? I mean, you get the Nigerian scam emails, you get, but what are you seeing in terms of other emerging threats?
It's a really interesting point. I mean, to be honest, I have my hands full mainly with North Korea and Russia at the moment. But the other one that's interestingly that's often listed in the top 4, certainly in the UK, is Iran. And again, it's a really interesting picture, I think. And again, culturally, you can look at that as different factors. I'm by no means an Iranian expert, but again, a country that values scientific prowess, that values technical knowledge, a country that has been pushed out of the world and is increasingly a pariah on the world stage. A country that has a very sort of youthful outlook and a very quite a go-getting outlook, and obviously has a very nationalistic element to it. So I find the Iranian picture quite interesting, and some of their campaigns have been really fascinating, I think.
Interesting. But back to North Korea. Have you actually ever been to North Korea?
I have not, and given what I've just been up to and the stuff I put out,
probably not going to get an invite.
Signs point
soon.
to no for that.
If you do get an invite, it's probably a one-way ticket, and I wouldn't take it.
Yeah,
so.
Yeah. But I have to. I mean, I have to say, there may come a time. I'm still not sure how this would happen, where the regime comes to an end, where North Korea's 26 million people are liberated, or at least live under a far less authoritarian rule. And I will be on the first plane out at that point, because I've heard so much about this country. I yearn to see it, and would love to see it.
It's amazing that the regime has lasted so long, and here's my opinion from the cheap seats, is that North Korea is they're convenient. The Chinese and the Russians, they like having North Korea there because it's a buffer. Even internally in China, I don't know if I think there are 37 different ethnic groups, and China from the outside looks like, oh, this monolithic China. But one of their biggest issues is they have all these different ethnic groups. Throughout China history, they've had many times where the country was divided into multiple different groups or regions, ongoing warfare, and they're very much focused on bringing everything together. But they have these internal pressures. One of which is there's a huge ethnic Korean population obviously it goes from North Korea, but into northern China, and when you meet people from that region and you ask them, are you Chinese, are you Korean? And they consider themselves to be ethnically Korean. And that takes prominence over their national, affiliation with China. So they definitely feel more Korean than Chinese ethnically. And even they feel like the people I've spoken to feel more loyal or connected with their ethnicity or that group than the PRC. Yeah, and if you talk to South Koreans, they will talk about the glory days when North Korea, South Korea, and that northern China part was all connected. And some people envision and hope for that unification. But I can tell you this, Japanese aren't, they're not looking forward to that day, because then you've got a nation of 100 million Koreans, and the Chinese obviously do not want to see part of their country peel off. So North Korea kind of it serves a very nice purpose, I don't know if you have any thoughts on that.
No, it's interesting. It's a very good point. I hadn't fully clocked it makes perfect sense, actually. There would be a huge Korean diaspora in China. And also from that perspective, obviously China's policy towards North Korea, which is a sort of weird push me, pull you policy, sometimes supportive, sometimes less supportive. Obviously what China's also thinking about strategically inside its own borders is, if we go up against North Korea and if we sway against them, how's that going to go for the people inside China who identify, as you say, strongly with Korea? Is that going to annoy them? Is that going to cause us problems? I mean, the Japan example is really fascinating. And again, before working on the podcast, and my co-host on the podcast, Jean Lee, who was a journalist in North Korea for many years, really filled in a lot of these gaps for me in my sort of North Korean knowledge. This idea of the Korean diaspora in Japan, and the idea that Japan's got a huge ethnic Korean population who, again, as you say, would identify very much as Korean. And interestingly, those people date from before, when North and South Korea were divided, before the country was divided into North and South Korea. So they went over to Japan in the maybe 30s or 40s or whatever, were Korean, because there wasn't North and South at that point. Then suddenly their home country gets divided into North and South. They're in Japan looking back and thinking, well, now do I side with the North? Do I side with the South? There's a bit of both. So the whole North Korea is a sort of key cog in this whole region. If you look at a watch or a clock, you'll have some tiny cog somewhere that you look at and you think, well, if that cog stops, it screws the whole. No matter that the other cogs are bigger, it doesn't matter. That tiny cog is actually turning a lot of the other ones. Fascinating.
No, it's a really good observation, and the situation in Japan is interesting because you having lived there for 5 or 6 years, and also having worked in Korea, a lot of things are on my radar and related to this topic. And most of the Korean schools in Japan, so you have like the French school, the British school, the American school, so all your expats would go there. But the Korean schools were founded by people from and who are loyal to North Korea. When I say from, as you said, there was no North or South then, but they were actually from that part of Korea. And after the Korean War, up until recently, even now, these organizations would, they have their North Korean community. They would raise money, or still do raise money, and send it back to North Korea. There's actually an amazing movie about a family, a Korean Japanese family in the late 60s who send their son to North Korea because they think that's the right thing to do. And then the poor kid can never come and visit. Finally, he gets to come visit, but they tell him, he's got cancer and he could get treated in Japan, but the North Korean government is like, no, he's got to come back. And if he doesn't come back, because at this point he has his own family in North Korea, and there's all kinds of threats, and it's based on one of many of the similar true stories. So it's a very interesting observation that you just made there. There are also a lot of Koreans in Japan who immigrated over the last 40, 50 years, who are actually also from South Korea. And so you get this kind of I guess vibe that, oh no, those are the guys from the North, and they're very, very super traditional, where the people from the South tend to be, because the South is obviously opened up, very different. They're both Korean, but very different outlooks, different cultures. So it's very interesting. What should our governments be doing, or what should organizations be doing to kind of protect themselves, or just to be aware of what the threats are, and it's specifically with North Korea, but maybe some of the other nation state actors?
Yeah, it's interesting. I think it's on three levels. There's what we as individuals can do, because the reality of this is this is one of these classic threats we face at the moment as a civilization. It's like climate change. A government can't do anything about it completely because government just can't work on that kind of global level. It's up to each of us individually, unfortunately, to solve some of these global problems, or at least to help solve some of these global problems. And computer hacking is one of them. It's a global threat. So, we have to take a bit of individual responsibility. The good news about that is the vast majority as well, you'll know, of these computer hacking threats come through email. If you look, and we've mentioned Bangladesh Bank already, we've mentioned these cryptocurrency exchanges. I cannot tell you how often it is that the email is the way in, and it's the attachment to the email that sinks you. You open the attachment, that's where the virus is. So if you want one lesson, the simple, easy tip, as they say on the internet, to get rid of this stuff, look at your emails really carefully, and attachments be super, super, super careful with. And that's what we can all do as sort of individuals. As organizations, there's lots of good stuff organizations can do. Again, educating their staff about emails, making them aware of the consequences. Look, you click that email, we give you a monthly paycheck, but if this company doesn't exist because we get hacked, into destruction, we're not going to be able to pay you. But also organizations can do good stuff like instituting multi-factor authentication, as they call it. So you get a text message on your phone when you log in somewhere, trying to segment your data as well, and trying to work out, okay, if they get in through that bit, let's make sure they can't just, travel across our network computer to computer and get to this bit over here, because that's really juicy stuff. And also, frankly, do you need to hang on to all this data? The less data you have, the easier it's going to be to encrypt it and to work out where it all is, but also the less of a target you are for computer hackers. So I think getting rid of a lot of this data, and it's heresy in this age, data being the new oil, but data also makes you a target for computer hackers. And at a sort of national level, in terms of governments, we have seen efforts by governments to work on cybercrime, to work on cybersecurity. There are collaborations and so on. And we've seen some good stuff in that direction. I think continuing conversations, particularly by law enforcement, cops getting to know each other at international conferences is good. I think there need to be more international conferences with countries at an international level. United Nations maybe needs to do a bit more on this kind of stuff. But that's going to be slowly. That's a gradual thing, but it needs to happen.
That was excellent. I just moderated a webinar specifically on this topic last week, and the webinar went on for almost an hour, and you just basically summarized some of the key best practices there in about 2 minutes. And yeah, no, it's excellent. I mean, one is like you just said. I mean, being aware of these business email compromise, attempts. Running phishing awareness campaigns, sometimes simulated phishing attacks, second factor or multi-factor authentication, good data governance. And yeah, I do like the analogy, because people say, yeah, data is the new oil or gold or whatever, but it's also, hazardous waste. So,
it really is. Yeah, it's toxic waste. Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. So that's some pretty darn good advice. Where do you see this threat specifically from North Korea? Do you see any kind of concerted activity from other governments to take away their resources, or is it just something that we as individuals and as organizations are going to have to protect ourselves?
It's a good question. I mean, look, the shortcut answer that yes, we are going to have to protect ourselves, but there have been some efforts to considerable efforts actually to hit North Korea as it's risen up the sort of cybersecurity agenda. The victims and the targets, notably the US, have tried to hit back. The problem is, in terms of actually putting people behind bars, North Korea does not, as far as I'm aware, have an extradition treaty with anybody. So, the US can charge people and have charged people, notably a character called Park Jin-hyuk, who's allegedly a member of the Lazarus Group hacking team. The US government has charged him. They put his photograph out. They've put all their evidence out against him. He's never going to see a US courtroom, is he? Let's face it. No. So there's a limited amount they could do. However, what these indictments do and what these criminal complaints do and what these research reports do very, very effectively is burns down North Korea's computer hacking architecture, its infrastructure. So, as soon as all these Twitter accounts they're using, or the email accounts, or the viruses they're using, as soon as those get exposed, those weapons are then useless in the future. So the more that the victims, the more that the accusers can do to sort of say, well, look, here's how we were hit, here's the stuff we were hit with, the more ineffective those become for the attackers. And also other victims can look and think, oh, well, okay, we're going to make sure we don't fall for that phishing email. We're going to make sure that we're protected against that computer virus. So there is stuff that the international community can do and is doing against the North Korean threat. But I have to say, I mean, if you're making upwards of $2 billion from computer hacking, that's very effective. It's a lot of money. And if I was the government in North Korea, I'd be thinking, keep going, chaps. You're doing very well.
Yeah. I
make
mean, what's
us
the
another billion.
what's the downside, right? It's
Yeah,
another
yeah,
slap on the wrist by the UN or the US or whatever.
yeah.
$2 billion sounds pretty nice. What's your sense in terms of the number of hacks that go, what's the word, kept secret? Because
Mm.
again, having lived in Japan, the corporate directors do not like to go to the news and
Mm.
say, here's some bad news. And
Mm.
they, oftentimes will look for any way possible to kind of not publicize things. What's your sense?
Oh God, it's a really good question. Look, it's like an iceberg. The bit above the water is always going to be smaller than the bit below the water.
Hmm.
It's got harder recently, hasn't it? I mean, GDPR, the EU data protection regulations have made it
Requires.
harder.
Yeah.
Have made it harder for organizations to not fess up. I mean, if you have an attack and you don't confess it to the data watchdog in the UK or in whatever other European country you're in, the fine's hefty, and the fine will get worse if you didn't fess up. So that's forced a lot of organizations to come clean. However, they're coming clean to the Information Commissioner's Office in the UK or whatever data watchdog it is. They're not coming clean to me as a journalist or to the public or necessarily to their customers. So look, inevitably, more cyber attacks are going to be secret and not exposed than are exposed. But impossible to put a figure on, I'm afraid.
Yeah, a couple of years ago, it was just a little over 2 years ago. I think Cathay Pacific had one of their customer databases compromised.
Oh yes, yes, yeah.
Yeah, and they sat on that for about
That's
11
right.
months. And then what happened is the people that were supposed to be reporting this were possibly going to be held up on criminal charges, not just being fined, right? So, but I, again, I think there are different shades of compliance depending on which country you're in. And I had a conversation with the head of IT for I was about a $2.5 billion organization in Japan. And we had made some recommendations in terms of, maybe your global admins should have multi-factor authentication turned on, and maybe you only give them global access when they need it, so that if their credentials are compromised, that the hackers wouldn't have global access unless somebody was going to elevate their permissions. There's a couple of fundamental security moves that are in line with what you just talked about. But with global admin, it's particularly important to have a second factor of authentication, especially if they're logging in, for example, outside the organization. And it was funny because the guy scratched his head. He's like, yeah, but wouldn't that make their job very difficult? And I was like, nah, it takes literally another few seconds to get that second factor of authentication. And they just considered that too kind of onerous and didn't want to implement. And so you see, wow, I mean, this is a $2.5 billion organization, and they've got facilities all across the country, some outside of Japan, and there's every time you have another facility, another location, that's another vector for attack, right? And they just weren't willing to do it, and it's so that I look at something like that, it's just a matter of time before they get hit. But then are they going to report? And I just wonder in some countries that they're paying these ransoms and not saying a word,
Yeah.
So, hey, do you have any, obviously your books, but any other books or journalists that whether it's cybercrime or crime in general, that you like to follow?
It's a very good question. I think that the Wired articles are really, really good. The Wired long reads. So Andy Greenberg's stuff is always really good. And he's got a new book coming out. He's a Wired journalist who wrote a book called Sandworm, which is about Russian originated, we think, attacks on energy infrastructure. So these were sort of the legendary Ukrainian blackout attacks, which actually switched off the power in Ukraine. It's obviously worth reading at the moment. And he's got a new one out, which is about how US officials and actually various law enforcement officials cracked into and managed to track down a bunch of people behind a paedophile network that was using cryptocurrency to disguise the transactions, and how cryptocurrency actually helped law enforcement track these guys down and track their funds down. So that's going to be really, really good. Kim Zetter, another Wired journalist. I'm not plugging for Wired. I've got no affiliation. But Kim Zetter wrote a book called Countdown to Zero, which is all about Stuxnet, which was the virus which infected an Iranian nuclear refinement facility. And that's absolutely astonishing. Yeah, one of the classic I'd recommend for anybody who's after just a ripping tale is The Cuckoo's Egg by Clifford Stoll. He was an IT worker. This was back in the 90s, I think it was 80s actually. And he just spotted a discrepancy and managed to untangle this bizarre story of cybercrime and cyber espionage that led right to the top tiers of the US government. It's still an absolutely astonishing book. So yeah, in addition to my own, I'd recommend those guys, but plenty out there.
That's interesting, and thanks for the recommendations. In terms of Clifford Stahl, and then what Snowden kind of revealed, was it different, similar?
Very, very different. Yeah, Clifford Stahl was revealing attempts to infiltrate U.S. military infrastructure by what we think is Russian computer hackers, very, very early Russian computer hackers in the 80s. Obviously, what Snowden revealed was kind of almost the other way around, I suppose.
I just misunderstood what you said. I thought it was you said it was activities by the U.S. government. It was activities targeting the U.S. government.
Targeting the U.S. government, yes.
Excellent, excellent. Okay. Well, hey, thanks for those recommendations. And the one last question. I mean, since I just brought up Snowden, what are your thoughts? In terms of, do we have the full story? And do you he's obviously, I think he's still in Russia, right? Do you ever see in the circles that you travel? I mean, how is he thought of, and do you see any kind of resolution ever happening?
It's a really interesting one, yeah. I mean, I've actually interviewed Edward Snowden a couple of times at various conferences. He is still in Russia. There was talk about his visa at some stage coming to an end. There was also talk as to whether the US government would pardon him. And obviously Hillary Clinton having a sort of certain input into that as to how that would work out, and the sort of Democratic government. But it's an interesting question as to what sort of happens with him in terms of the fallout from his stuff. I sort of feel like the US government reacted a bit more strongly than the UK government did, because it was mainly UK and certainly our interest, UK-US relations. In the US, I felt like there was a bit more of a sense of taking that stuff seriously. However, you still have secret courts that will sign off warrants. You still have the architecture of the state that's able to do sort of state-level surveillance. And there's still this aspect, as far as I'm aware, which is that spying on non-US citizens is okay to do, and for the UK, spying on non-UK citizens is okay to do. And there was this lovely little sort of fudge they came up with in the middle, where they were able to do each other's dirty work, right? Utilizing those loopholes. So I'm not entirely sure, certainly from the UK's perspective, whether much changed. And what I felt would be needed was some kind of general public oversight of what our intelligence agencies were doing. I understand you can't tell the general public all of the secret stuff the intelligence agencies do, but on a broad level, if you map out, this is the capability that we'd like to have, I think some of the general public would be shocked by that and say, well, hang on, you can't, hack into people's personal email accounts, to do X, Y, and Z. So I do feel like in the UK, we haven't really fully finished that debate. And I think there's still debate to be had about how our intelligence agencies work and how surveillance en masse works. Because obviously in the age of the internet, mass surveillance is far more possible than it was in years gone by.
Yeah, it's interesting in the U.S. because public sentiment seems to be divided very, very sharply, either in terms of, what he did, he's a patriot, and then there's an equally just super strong, visceral kind of, no, he's a traitor.
Yes,
and
exactly.
And the interesting thing is the people that tend to say, they're government conspiracists, and the government's out there to take advantage of us, so we need to support somebody like Trump, who's an outsider, who can drain the swamps, whatever. These people who are already convinced that the government is up to no good at pretty much everything tend to be the ones that also say that Snowden is a traitor. And I'm like, so it's there, so it's kind of this, we support we don't trust the government, except maybe the military, because and that's the patriotic thing to do. And I'm like, don't you see the kind of contradiction here? But no, So,
broadly speaking, I mean, what I would say about the Snowden stuff is if everything Snowden had revealed was okay with the public, it wouldn't have gotten to be a news story. The Guardian, would have put it out in the UK and other outlets around the world, and people would have shrugged and gone, oh, well, that's all right then. The fact that there is, as you say, a section of society that was incensed by that, and also a section of society that was fine with it and thought, yes, this is what we do. What that says to me is there's a debate. There's a debate to be. It's not like society has one opinion or it's all fine. There is different views, and so the very fact that Snowden stories became stories indicated to me that there was differences of opinion, and that we needed to talk about that and have an open conversation about it, to decide what was okay, what is okay for us to do. And that has to happen through our politicians. That's what we elect them for in democracies, to sort of speak for us. And so I felt people were saying, well, this Snowden should just get back in his box and shouldn't have talked about any of this. I'm like, well, if people hadn't reacted to it, then it wouldn't be a story. The fact it's a story means it's something that people care about and don't always agree with. So that's why I landed.
And maybe we just become habituated to it and numb to it, and after a while it does become the new normal. I mean, if you talk to people in China, they know what the government's up to, but they're like, our lives are better than they were before, and it's so it's it'll be interesting to see which direction we go. So what's up, or what future plans do you have?
So I'm still working on the second series of the Lazarus Heist. Yeah, I should have mentioned that. The podcast series that went out on the BBC last year. There's going to be a second series of that podcast later this year. I'm sort of saying October, it'll be about October time. So series 1 stopped in 2017, and the story stops there. The book, which is going to be out on June the 9th, fills in the sort of ensuing sort of 5 years. But series 2 of the podcast goes even a bit further than that and fills in even more of the gaps, because the Lazarus Group, according to the investigators tracking it, has not slowed down and has sped up. So second series of the Lazarus Heist. And I'm also hoping to write another book. And what I'm concentrating on this time is money laundering and how technology has revolutionized the art of money laundering.
That's definitely topical, and I look forward to the podcast. I'm going to put links to your books, the podcast, and what else should we link to in the show notes?
Books and the podcast is fine for me. That's all good.
That's awesome. Well, hey, Geoff, I've really enjoyed this conversation, and look forward to your podcast, and wish you the best for the remainder of 2022.
Thank you, Mark. Appreciate it. Take care.
Hello, welcome to Secure Talk, your trusted source of information on the latest threats, trends, tools, and technology related to cybersecurity and compliance.